Hi, this is Scott Lancer, the Director of Associates for Biblical Research, and we're here today for another episode of Digging for Truth. This is our second episode in our interview with Dr. Frank Turek, the president of crossexamine.org. And Frank, thanks again for being with us today.
Scott, always great being with you. Let's do show two.
Show two, that's right. And in the last episode, we introduced the four major subject areas that are covered in your book, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. And I encourage our viewers to pick up that book. I know I regularly go to it when I'm trying to get my discussion, my arguments clear in my conversations with those who need the Lord and who are struggling with issues of truth. Now, in this last episode, we talked about, we discussed, can truth be known? Can we know truth? What is truth? And then we looked at, does God exist? And we talked about the main arguments for God and that whole discussion. But in your book, you, of course, move into the subject of miracles and then the authority of the Bible. And so I'd like to kind of start today, if we can, with that whole subject of miracles. Frank, how do miracles and that whole discussion, how does that connect with teens, with young adults? How does that argumentation impact their lives?
Well, the point is that we have to show that miracles are possible, because if they're not possible, then no teen or no adult is going to consider Christianity to be true, because Christianity is based on at least two major miracles: the creation of the universe and the resurrection of Jesus. Now, obviously, Jesus did about 35 other miracles, but the central miracle that he did is resurrecting from the dead. And if that's not possible, if you can't resurrect from the dead, if science has somehow disproven it, or we don't see them anymore, so we shouldn't believe in them, then Christianity is not going to be considered a plausible option for people. So we always have to, after showing that truth exists and God exists, are miracles possible? Yeah.
And that is, it's interesting when you're talking with young people, they will, they'll believe a lot of different crazy ideas sometimes, really, have conversations about aliens coming to the planet and all kinds of other topics, and they seem to be so clear on that. Or if you talk about whether or not the zodiac has influence on their life, they seem to embrace those things. And then you talk about the historic nature of our faith, and I don't believe that. And so,
I know, well, even atheist Christopher Hitchens, who I had the opportunity to debate a couple of times, and by the way, you can see these debates on our website for free, crossexamine.org. Even he knew that astrology was bunk. He said in his book, astrology can be shown to be false just by pointing out the fact that two people with the same birthday don't have the same future.
Yeah.
It's just it's obvious as that. But when it comes to miracles, I think a lot of people don't believe in miracles because they think they've never seen one, or they think that science has disproven them. And what I do is I ask people, I say, what's the greatest miracle in the Bible? And most Christians will say the resurrection, to which I'll respond, no. The resurrection's easy compared to the greatest miracle. The greatest miracle in the Bible is actually the first verse. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth.
Yes.
I mean, if God really created the heavens and the earth, then obviously a resurrection's easy. If he can create the whole show out of nothing, can he do whatever he wants that's not logically impossible inside the universe? If he can create the whole universe out of nothing? Of course. He can resurrect Jesus. He can part the Red Sea. He can walk on water. He created water. Of course he can walk on it, right? I mean, this is easy for God to create the universe out of nothing. And here's the interesting point to this whole discussion that I think hits people between the eyes, Scott. It's this: even atheists are admitting the data for Genesis 1:1. Even they're saying that the universe had a beginning. Now, they try and come up with another explanation other than God. They fail, but they're admitting the data, that space, time, and matter literally had a beginning out of nothing. Well, again, if that's the case, then whatever created space, time, and matter must transcend space, time, and matter. In other words, the cause must be spaceless, timeless, immaterial, powerful, personal, and intelligent to create the universe out of nothing. See our first show for the details there, but we talked about that already. So if Genesis 1:1 is true, every other verse is at least possible.
Yeah. Now, you'll hear people say things like, well, Jonah couldn't have been swallowed by a great fish. And you hear all they go to some specific biblical texts and they'll challenge them. But if creation is legitimate and real and true, then these other miracles are small potatoes.
Yes, I mean, Jonah and Noah are crazy. Let's admit it. They're crazy unless God exists. Of course, you can't explain it naturally. It's not meant to be explained naturally. It's supposed to be supernatural. But if God can create the universe out of nothing, he can do Jonah, Noah, he can do resurrections, he can do any of the stuff you read about in the Bible. Now, here's what is often overlooked about this, Scott. People think miracles are happening all the time in the Bible. Actually, they're not. If you look at how many miracles there are in the Bible, there's about 250. And if you just take them from Abraham to Jesus, that's about 2,000 years, Jesus and the apostles. If you divide 250 miracles over 2,000 years, you get a miracle once every 8 years. Of course, they don't occur once every 8 years. They occur in bunches. They occur in 3 basic time periods: Moses, Elijah and Elijah, and Jesus and the apostles. Why? Because the miracle is designed to confirm the sermon. The sign confirms the sermon. The miracle confirms the messenger. I mean, why are people going to listen to Moses? Because he can do miracles. Why are people going to listen to Elijah and Elijah? Because they can do miracles. Why are people going to listen to Jesus and the apostles? Because they can do miracles. So that confirms that these individuals speak for God. So miracles actually aren't happening very often in the Bible either.
Yeah, and something to consider, and we have about a minute left here, Frank, something to consider is that we overlook, and people just generally overlook, the miraculous nature of reality itself. The physical world is just filled with the miraculous.
Yeah, when people say they don't believe in miracles, I say, look around, you're living in one. This universe is a miracle. It literally came out of nothing. But another point is that people don't believe miracles because they've never seen one, to which I respond, well, you ought not expect to see a lot of miracles, because miracles have to be rare if they're going to get our attention. For example, if people rose from the dead routinely, what would the resurrection of Christ mean to us? Nothing. You know, you go to somebody, you go, Jesus rose from the dead to prove he was God. And you go, so what? Uncle George just rose from the dead 2 weeks ago. You know, now I got to give the inheritance back. No, it's got to be a rare event if it's going to get our attention. If people were resurrecting from the dead routinely, the resurrection of Christ would mean nothing. That's right.
That's right. All right, very good. Well, we're here today with Dr. Frank Turek, and we're going to continue our conversation in regards to his book, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. And we'll be right back and continue this fascinating discussion.
Bible and Spade is a non-technical quarterly publication published by the Associates for Biblical Research. Written from a scholarly and conservative viewpoint, Bible and Spade supports the inerrancy of the biblical record and is a must-read for both the serious Bible student and anyone asking if they can really trust the Bible. Archaeological evidence, properly interpreted, upholding the history of the Bible. Subscribe today at BibleArchaeology.org.
And welcome back to Digging for Truth today. We're here today with Dr. Frank Turek. And Frank is sharing with us the four major concerns, major issues from his book, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. And I want to encourage our viewers to please check out his website, check out the materials he's written. It is very helpful in your as you talk with those who need the Lord, those who are struggling over some of the great issues of truth. Does God exist? We just got finished discussing miracles, and now we're going to focus our attention on the authority of the Bible, and particularly the New Testament writers who, we start with the New Testament because the implications there for truth and for the legitimacy of the authority of the Bible, we start there, and then, of course, if the New Testament is true, the resurrection is true, then everything else is true. So, Frank, let's get started there with those New Testament writers. You know, they wrote things about themselves. They wrote things about Jesus, which would be considered very embarrassing. Normally, you would keep all that stuff out of the written record. Maybe you could just discuss that a little bit.
Sure. In our book, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, and also the book called Stealing from God, we point out that there's a lot of reasons to believe the New Testament writers are telling the truth. And I like to alliterate things. So I give 8 reasons that the New Testament writers are telling the truth in the Stealing from God book in particular. They all begin with the letter E. So we have early testimony, we have eyewitness testimony, we have embarrassing testimony, which we'll talk about here in a second. We have excruciating deaths. These are people that died for what they said they saw. I think we'll talk about that in another segment here. We also have expected testimony that deals with Old Testament prophecy. We have embedded confirmation, which people can see more about if they Google the phrase undesigned coincidences. Undesigned coincidences. By the way, that's the best evidence that most of you have never heard about to show that the New Testament writers are independently witnessing the same historical events. There's also the explosive growth of the church from Jerusalem, and there are other reasons. But let's just talk about embarrassing testimony. And by the way, this is one of many, as I just mentioned. None of these alone will convince you that the New Testament writers are telling the truth, but when you put them all together, you go, wow, this is pretty impressive. And embarrassing testimony goes like this. If there's something embarrassing to the author or authors, it's probably true. Why? Because you're not going to invent embarrassing details about yourself. I mean, you're going to hide those things, if anything. You're certainly not going to invent them. And it turns out that the New Testament writers have filled the New Testament with embarrassing details they never would have invented. By the way, this is true of the Old Testament as well, but we're just looking at the New Testament. For example, the New Testament writers depict themselves as dim-witted, right? They don't understand what Jesus' mission is. Most of the time, they say, we didn't know what he was talking about. We didn't know what he meant. They actually don't get his mission, Scott, until he's already ascended to heaven. And then they go, wow, I could have had a V8, right? But up to that point, they don't quite get it. They also, for example, their leader is involved in very embarrassing incidents, right? Peter is called Satan by Jesus. I don't think they made that up. Peter also says, Lord, I'll never deny you. What does he wind up doing? He winds up denying him 3 times. Paul rebukes Peter in the book of Galatians for trying to get the New Testament believers to obey these Old Testament laws. He's actually what we would say is dope slapping Peter in the Bible. Now, this is embarrassing. Why are they putting this in there if they're making all this up? And probably the most embarrassing thing they did is all the disciples, maybe with the exception of one, they all ran away at the crucifixion. And the brave ones who stayed behind are the women. Now, Scott, what man is going to invent this?
Right.
I mean, what man is going to invent that he was hiding for fear of the Jews while the women went down and discovered the empty tomb? I don't think anyone would invent that. This is not an invented story.
Yeah, and people often don't think about these things. What you've just stated there, these are important evidences for the legitimacy of the material. It always amazes me how transparent the New Testament is. And, you know, I think Peter's the one that probably gets roughed up the worst of the whole bunch, I think.
He does. And think about the fact that the women were the first witnesses. That's not only embarrassing to men, it's also not a good defense of the position that they're trying to promote, because in that culture, a woman's testimony was not considered on par with that of a man. So if you were making up this New Testament story, you'd only have the men be the first witnesses. Yet all 4 Gospels say the women were the first witnesses, which is telling us what? They must have been. Scott, I actually had a woman come up to me once and she said, I know why Jesus appeared to the women first. And I said, why? And she said, because he wanted to get the story out. I said, you know, that is an excellent point. I had not thought about that. So there's so many, by the way, there's even embarrassing details potentially about Jesus. You know, in Mark chapter 3, his own family wants to seize him and take him home because they think he's nuts.
Yeah.
Now, you may have heard people say, the scholars will say, well, the New Testament writers invented Jesus to be God. Oh, really? Then why is Mark chapter 3 in there? This is not an invented story. He's also called a drunkard. Jesus is. He's called demon-possessed. He has his feet white with the hair of a prostitute, which is easily going to be seen as a sexual advance. And oh, by the way, there are 2 prostitutes in his bloodline, the Messiah's bloodline, Rahab and Tamar. Now, you think they made this up? You think Matthew and Luke said, you know, we really ought to spice up the Messiah's bloodline a little bit. Let's put a couple of prostitutes here in the genealogy. No. They're just telling the truth, as embarrassing as it is.
Yeah. And what's interesting when you study other pagan literature, put it that way, other literature of the time of Christ and before, back to the Egyptians, they're always twisting the history. They're always bragging. Yeah. They're always showing the very best things. You see it consistently. And when they're not doing that, they're making up mythology to lift up their culture, their country, whatever. They're doing these things in order to look good. That seems to be the constant focus, whereas the New Testament is focused on the truth, telling us what actually happened, which is a great argument for the fact that the historical claims of the New Testament are true. Frank, we only have a few seconds here, but maybe you could comment on that.
Yeah, I would just say, well, the New Testament and even the Old Testament is really the no spin zone.
Yeah,
they're telling the truth, as embarrassing as it is. I mean, even you look at the Old Testament, you think about all the so-called heroes of the faith are all Olympic quality sinners. You know, they get the gold medal in sin.
Yeah.
Think about David, a man after God's own heart. Yeah, but he's a liar, adulterer, and a murderer. Gee, I guess there's hope for the rest of us. You know, they're not inventing these characters. They're real people.
That's right. All right. Very good. Well, this is an enjoyable conversation today with Dr. Frank Turek, and we will be back and we'll continue this discussion about the New Testament writers and the amazing things they wrote that really uphold the authority of the Bible. And we're going to be back in just a few moments.
In a culture of intense Bible-denying skepticism, Associates for Biblical Research exists to strengthen followers of Jesus by affirming the authority of the Bible. Our archaeological fieldwork and original research form a strong foundation in upholding the reliability of the Scriptures for students or anyone asking if they can really trust the Bible. Please visit our website and partner with us by joining our prayer team or financially supporting this ministry. And thank you for standing with us.
And welcome back to Digging for Truth, here today with Dr. Frank Turek. Frank, it's been a great discussion. We've been continuing basically unpackaging the material that's found in your book, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. But these topics are critical for us. These four major issues are critical for our witness to people who need the Lord. We've talked about what is truth, does God exist? We've talked about miracles. We're now looking at the New Testament. And we talked about the embarrassing material in the New Testament, but now we want to shift focus a little bit to what happened to these apostles. Many of them died horrible deaths. Maybe you could talk about what that means for us.
Well, what we need to remember is that the folks that wrote the New Testament down were all Jewish believers in Yahweh before Jesus rose from the dead. Mm-hmm. They did not invent a new religion out of whole cloth. They were already what they thought to be God's chosen people. Now, what motive would these people have to invent a resurrected Jesus? You know, the only non-Christian, or I should say the only non-Jew that wrote the New Testament a book was Luke. Everyone else is a Jew, as far as we know. We don't know who wrote Hebrews, but everybody else we know is a Jew. Why would Jews invent a resurrected Jesus? What did they get by making up this new religion? Well, they got excommunicated from the synagogue, and then they got beaten, tortured, and killed. Last time I checked, that was not a list of perks, right? They're not going to invent a resurrected story or a story about a resurrected Jesus to get themselves kicked out of the synagogue and then beaten, tortured, and killed. There's no motive for this. In fact, I know this is going to sound almost heretical for people who believe the Bible's inerrant like I do, but it's not. Just stick with me for a second. And here's my point. Christianity is not true because a series of documents we put under one binding we call the Bible says it's true. In fact, Christianity would be true if the Bible never existed. You go, wait a minute, isn't our faith based on the Bible? No, our faith is not based on the Bible. Our faith is based on an event, the resurrection. There would be no resurrection, or I should say there would be no New Testament unless the resurrection occurred.
Yeah.
That's why we have a New Testament, because the resurrection occurred. In fact, you could put it this way. The New Testament writers did not create the resurrection. The resurrection created the New Testament writers. There would be no New Testament unless Jesus rose from the dead. Now, if Jesus rose from the dead, and that shows that Jesus is God, then whatever God teaches is true. Look, I just have a personal policy, Scott. If somebody rises from the dead, I just believe whatever the guy says, okay? So Jesus rises from the dead. He proves he's God. He says the entire Old Testament is the Word of God, and he promises the New Testament.
Yeah.
Well, if that's the case, then you can make a case that the Bible's inerrant. But you don't need inerrancy to show that Christianity's true. You don't start with inerrancy. Inerrancy is not a premise, it's a conclusion. I never talk about inerrancy when I'm talking to an atheist. I talk about the resurrection. I talk about the fact that God exists and Jesus rose from the dead, and if that's the case, then we can ultimately arrive at inerrancy. But you don't have to believe in inerrancy to be a Christian. You have to believe in the resurrection to be a Christian. So stay on the resurrection.
Yeah, yeah. The essential message of the gospel has to be preached, taught, expressed to people. They have to know the essential truths to be saved. And that's critical. Now, obviously, there are lots of people that don't believe the Bible. They don't believe it's inspired. They don't believe it's inerrant. But
you don't have to believe it's inspired or inerrant to even know that it's true.
Yeah.
Right? That the basic reliability is there. That, yeah, they're not making this up. Jesus really walked out of the tomb. You arrive at inerrancy and inspiration later. You don't start there.
Yeah.
You start with just the fact that, hey, an event occurred. How do we explain this event?
Yeah.
Right? Let's look at the evidence. And it's, by the way, it's not just the New Testament documents that have evidence regarding. I mean, you're doing archaeology, right?
Yeah.
You have non-Christian writers that talk about what they think happened in the New Testament. They're not eyewitnesses, but in New Testament times. So you've got other evidence than just the New Testament documents. We have to look at the New Testament as just historical documents. You don't have to look at them when you're doing research to assume they're inspired, inerrant words of God. No, you arrive at that conclusion later, but you start by just saying, hey, these are documents. Let's see what they have to say. Yeah,
that's right. So the New Testament, if we affirm that the New Testament documents are true, we extrapolate, in this case, backwards, and we look at the Old Testament and say, wow, if Christ rose from the dead, the things written here are true, the rest of this is true. And I think about those disciples, they came to faith in Christ. Like you said, some of them, they took a long time till the light went on, and they saw the truth. And because they believed, in their case, they believed the Old Testament, but they didn't understand it. And they did.
In fact, Paul and the apostles did not try and convince non-Jews that the Old Testament was true. What did they do? They talked about the resurrection.
Yeah.
They didn't go to the Old Testament scriptures and say, well, you got to believe all this, and then you got to believe in the resurrection. They started at the resurrection and said, the resurrection's true. Then we'll work backwards and search the scriptures in the Old Testament to see if any of this was prophesied in the Old Testament. Turns out it was. That's why Jesus said, look, the whole Old Testament's about me.
Yeah.
But, the Old Testament, or let me put it this way. The New Testament, by the way, I don't drink coffee. You guys wouldn't expect that because I'm going through so much so quickly here because we have limited time. But the New Testament is sort of like the box top to a jigsaw puzzle called the Old Testament, right? You ever try and put a jigsaw puzzle together without the box top? It's hard. But the New Testament provides the box top to the Old Testament. And so then you can understand the Old Testament better after you see the box top called the New Testament.
Yeah, very, very good. Well, Frank, we're quickly coming down to our the end of our program here today. We've covered a lot of ground, and you masterfully covered it quickly. If we were when we are witnessing to unbelievers, we're focusing on that resurrection event. Now, you just have a couple seconds. Why is that so critical to focus on that?
Because everything rises or falls on the resurrection. If the resurrection occurred, Christianity's true. If it didn't occur, Christianity's false. You might as well sleep in on Sunday, as Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15. If Christ didn't rise from the dead, your faith's in vain. So concentrate on the resurrection. Show the evidence for that. Now, we have a book called I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, another book called Stealing from God, and a complete DVD series called Why I Still Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, and even an online course you can take called I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. So there's a lot more
Great
than what we
stuff.
could cover here in these 2 short segments. So check those things out.
Absolutely. Dr. Frank Turek, thank you for being with us today. We encourage our audience to check out Frank's work, and we're grateful that you've joined us today on this episode of Digging for Truth. We hope it's been an encouragement and an inspiration to your walk with Christ. Thanks again for being with us today.